When examining J.R.R. Tolkien's legacy and his impact on fantasy mediums outside of literature, one simply cannot deny the influence he's had on tabletop gaming, and more specifically, Dungeons & Dragons. In a discussion about the birth of D&D, John Rateliff states, Tolkien's fingerprints are all over the original D&D. Look at the 4-player character races from the original 3-booklet set that came out in 1973 and 74. Men, dwarves, elves, hobbits. Those are the 4 things you can play. All of them are from Tolkien. 3 out of 4 are directly derived. Speaking of dwarves and elves, he also brings up the fact that Tolkien himself popularized the commonly used V rather than F rule for the plural of elves and dwarves. We see evidence of this on the first page of The Hobbit, where Tolkien states, in English the only correct plural of dwarf is dwarfs, and the adjective is dwarfish. In this story, dwarves and dwarvish are used. Rateliff continues, there's a simple fact that Tolkien's innovations are so great they've become to be considered generic. Generic fantasy often is another phrase for Tolkienian fantasy. They only appear to be generic because modern fantasy is something Tolkien himself largely created. He's the example that defines the whole category. Rateliff concludes, the very idea of the player-character party from Dungeons & Dragons, a group of diverse individuals of different races with differing talent and specialties who set off in an adventure together, is uniquely Tolkienian. In an article about Tolkien's influence on D&D, writer Jeff McLeod says, it does not seem to be a controversial claim that TSR, the original publisher of the game, built D&D on the back of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. So much so that in the 1970s, Tolkien Enterprises sent out a cease and desist letter to CSR claiming that the creators of D&D appropriated Tolkien's intellectual property. TSR responded by altering some of the more obvious examples where content was copied from Tolkien's work. For example, hobbits was changed into halflings. The alteration distances D&D from Tolkien, but it also raises an interesting point regarding the language which connects them. The word hobbit was removed because it became legally problematic. But what about the ethically problematic word used to describe the category under which it fell? The word in question, race. Could or should this word be removed or changed? In an article titled Privilege, Power, and Dungeons & Dragons, Antero Garcia writes, like video games, the changes in language, design, and political orientation in D&D occur only with the occasional release of new editions of the gaming system. It is a process that is arrested in its development and perhaps has taken an inordinate amount of time to move beyond problematic representations of race and gender. So, establishing and maintaining fair and equal representation takes time, but what about the use of the word itself? Tolkien seems the inspiration for its original inclusion in D&D, but does its use similarly reflect the author's own evolving thoughts on the word? In a lecture titled Revisiting Race in Tolkien's Legendarium, Dr. Dimitra Fimi points out that dividing human beings into races with fixed biological characteristics and associating these physical traits with specific mental abilities was considered not only natural, but also scientifically proven and supported in the 19th and early 20th centuries. She goes on to say, it was not until the atrocities of World War II that scientific disagreements were brought to the fore and the scientific community declared that race was a myth, a subject only for biology and genetics and not anthropology and ethology. Given Tolkien's personal experience with World War II and the prevalence of Nazi eugenics at the time, his use of the word race stands out. But Fimi goes on to say, Tolkien's views on race changed throughout his lifetime, along with contemporary ideas and intellectual trends of his times. But how does the history and complexity of Tolkien's personal experience with the word translate from his text to Gygax's game? Garcia writes, race, racism, and the cultural lessons that D&D teaches about innate feelings of distrust for individuals different from oneself are complicated. Fundamentally, race in D&D does not mean what it typically means in educational research. Instead, the races of D&D are largely a binary of human or demi-human. Further, ignoring racism still exists within the game. Garcia continues, racism is built into the D&D system. Early adventures published for D&D, such as A1 Slave Pits of the Undercity, focus on players freeing slaves and fighting oppressive forces. Although these adventures are set in a fictitious realm, racial differences drive evil intent and spark a tautology of who is inherently good or evil. Fimi further discusses Tolkien's use of inherent good and evil in her lecture, saying, such intrinsically evil creatures as goblins, orcs, gnomes, or whatever else they might have been called, have developed into stable characters in modern fantasy, often viewed as an easy way to create enemies for the main heroes to fight. She concludes that Tolkien needed to create a species of beings that would represent the forces of evil and which would engage in battles and warfare with the good side without evoking pity of the readers. In that sense, the orcs are ideal. They are intrinsically evil without any hope of salvation, and they are full of hatred for anything good or beautiful. In a private letter sent by Tolkien, he gives a clearer image of the orc, saying, "The orcs are definitely stated to be corruptions of the human form seen in elves and men. They are, or were, squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. While the depiction comes across as dated at best and perhaps even racist at worst, Femi argues that this statement is important from an anthropological point of view, as it seems to reflect popular ideas of the traditional hierarchy of the three extreme human racial types: the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, and the Negroid. In this case, Tolkien seems to identify himself with the European race, usually associated with the Caucasoid, and chooses for his villains the physical characteristics and extreme of the so-called Mongoloid race, traditionally seen as inferior from a Western European perspective. To close, I'd like to call back to Femi's earlier use of the word species, because it brings us back to a question I raised earlier. Does the use of the word race in today's game of Dungeons & Dragons follow Tolkien's own changing views on the word? Well, if we're to believe Femi's argument that Tolkien followed along with contemporary ideas and intellectual trends of his times, then I would argue the answer is yes. Because Tolkien recognizes the evolving nature of people and their languages. For proof, just take a look at Appendix F of Lord of the Rings. Here we see, for example, another mention of the plural of dwarves, in which Tolkien elaborates, "It is to this mark that I have ventured to use the form dwarves, and remove them a little, perhaps, from the sillier tales of these latter days." Perhaps, too, the continued use of the word race has become rather silly in modern times. Therefore, for these reasons, I think Tolkien would support the announcement made by Wizards of the Coast, D&D's current publisher, in December of this year, which stated, "Dungeons & Dragons has a history of evolving to meet the needs of our players and foster an inviting space for everyone. With that in mind, we understand race is a problematic term that has had prejudiced links between real-world people and the fantasy peoples of D&D worlds. The usage of the term across D&D and other popular IP has evolved over time. Now it's time for the next evolution. We have made the decision to move on from using the term race everywhere in D&D, and we do not intend to return to that term. The term species was chosen in close coordination with multiple outside cultural consultants."